All right, we will go ahead and get started. It's 2:30. We'll get our last session out of the way. I think it's definitely one that is interesting. It's been, I think, MISO and SPP have been referenced at least half of the time. So no pressure, Andy and Casey. People are just, looking for answers from you all to solve all the problems. So first up, we do have Andy with MISO online. Andy, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me all right?
We hear you, yes.
Let me see if I can get my video on here.
Nope, that's Jamie, isn't it?
How about this? There we go.
There we go. Fantastic. All right. So this last session is on MISO and SPP. It's a very general topic. They're going to hit a lot of big things that are going on. They have a lot of stuff going on. So hopefully you'll find it interesting, and we'll get this going. Andy, just let me know when you want to go to the next panel or slide, and I'll hit the button for you. Okay.
I appreciate that. Thank you all for letting me join virtually today and speak with you about MISO and where we are and trying to enable the energy evolution that's been a lot of the talk today. Again, my name is Andy Whitmire. I'm the Director of Resource Utilization for MISO. That's our generator interconnection queue, as well as any requests to add surplus, retire, or to replace existing interconnection service. Next slide. First few slides, just kind of an overview of where MISO is and who we are. We were the first RTO formed back in 1998. That's our footprint there. We split our footprint up into 3 separate regions. We operate the entire footprint as one balancing authority with one area control area or one ACE, but we have 3 separate reliability regions with reliability coordinators in the 3 offices noted there on the slide operating on that footprint. So Missouri is managed by our central RCs out of our Carmel, Indiana footprint. We manage about 66,000 miles of transmission from our members with about 184 gigawatts of generating capacity. Our peak season demand was 127 gigawatts, which was several years ago. On average, our summer peak is around 120 gigawatts. And we serve over 42 million people. There, the pie chart is showing kind of the breakdown of our existing generation capacity. If you were to look at that, 10 years ago, it was very much a Pac-Man looking display with coal as being our main source of power. That certainly has changed over the years as a lot of coal resources have retired and the amount of renewables on the system have increased. Next slide. Yeah, so what does MISO do? We manage the power grid. We provide markets for power generators to bid their generation into the market and end-use customers to be able to buy that power on a wholesale market or on a wholesale level. We utilize the transmission grid of our members in order to transmit that power from the generation source to the end users. Or overall responsible for the reliability of the grid from both a real-time and a long-term planning horizon. Of course, we're really just on the high voltage transmission, generally 100 kV and above. Your distribution systems are all still managed by your local utility. Next slide. Several years ago, MISO defined what we call the reliability imperative. It's basically saying, hey, the system is changing, it's evolving, the energy evolution is occurring, and what does MISO need to do to be able to help usher that change in and to enable our footprint to continue to be reliable in the future? We have 4 pillars of that reliability imperative. Market redefinition, which is looking at what are the market changes that we need to make to ensure that we're incentivizing the the attributes and the system characteristics that we need. Order 841 was discussed earlier today. Ensuring that storage resources are properly available and priced appropriately as part of market redefinition. Long-range planning, that's looking at what are the future system needs on a broader scale, what transmission is necessary in order to enable that fleet evolution. We're going to need to be able to get wind power to areas where the wind's not blowing, or solar power to where the sun's not showing or where it is. So the diversity of our footprint will certainly help save costs over time, but we need the transmission in order to get that generation from one area of our system to the other. Operations of the future is looking at, what is the state of operations in the future as our existing employees begin to retire and new operators are coming on, the types of improved computer skills and what does the system look like in the future that we'll be operating. To markets enhancements, that is what our systems have not been updated much in the last several years. So what do we need to do to our current system capabilities to keep them going while we implement that next evolution of technology to be able to move MISO into the future. But I'm a planning guy now. After spending 17 years in operations at MISO, I've been in planning for the last few years, and so we've been heavily involved in long-range planning. So if we go to the next slide, I'll give an overview of LRTP. We've split LRTP into 4 tranches that we started back in 2020 and will go on for several more years. Tranche 1, which we'll show in a slide here in a second, resulted in 18 transmission projects for over $10 billion of investment in our north and central regions. So a large amount of initial investment that's going to help enable that energy evolution. Tranche 2, which is there's an indicative roadmap there below this, is kind of an initial hypothesis of lines that we think may be needed to continue to allow where we believe the future energy sources will be and will be utilized to serve that load. Tranche 3 will be focused on our southern part of our footprint. And then Tranche 4 is looking at how do we improve that capability between our north-central footprint and our southern footprint. There in that bar chart is the amount of, we have a significant amount of available capacity in the south that's not available to the north and central parts of our footprint because of the amount of capability that we have between the north and south. So how do we unlock that capacity so that it's available to the rest of our footprint? Next slide. So this is the result of Tranche 1. Again, it was $10.3 billion, those 18 projects. You could see a significant new 345 line coming out of Iowa through Missouri into Illinois that'll be part of this portfolio of projects. We're now in the siting stages and the competitive transmission portion of getting these projects that can be competitively bid, which is about $1 billion to the portfolio, out for solicitation. The rest of the lines are mainly in ROFR states or right of first refusal, so the incumbent TOs are going to be building those. But all of these lines still have to go through the state process and to the state utilities to be able to get the authority to build these lines within these states. And so MISO will be supporting that process as well as continuing to look at what does Tranche 2, what are the future needs for Tranche 2. Next slide. So what does that energy evolution look like? This is the state of our current generator and connection queue. When I joined the team in 2020, we had a record year with 52 gigawatts of new requests, and we've surpassed that the last 2 years, from 77 gigawatts in 21 all the way to 171 gigawatts of new requests in 2022. We think a big reason for that large jump in new requests in 2022 was three reasons. One, customers, customer demand. Folks are still wanting a lot of renewable energy. The IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, passed by Congress, had a lot of incentives, production tax credits that are spurring the development of new renewable resources. And of course, the long-range vision plan I just talked about added a lot of transmission capacity that generators want to take advantage of. That $10 billion transmission will certainly enable a lot of generation and reduce the overall costs to developers to connect to the grid because of that available capacity. We certainly still have a backlog of generation requests going all the way back to 2019 in some cycles, but mainly 20, 21, and 22 projects. So our current queue is sitting at almost 244 gigawatts of projects. And again, that's double the amount of load in MISO on a normal summer peak. So a lot of this generation will end up dropping out because there's no one to buy it. But we need to be able to find out or to tell those developers which are the best projects to continue to develop based on cost. That's one of the main drivers for development of new generation assets is what's the cost going to be able to interconnect and get transmission service for that generator. So me and my team are working hard on working through that backlog and getting those answers to the developers, and so they can continue to operate and develop that generation. Not on this slide is the 42 gigawatts of generation that's already out of our queue and just waiting to come online. And so we're trying to do a better job of track that and show folks what has successfully gone through our queue, and we're looking forward to having on the system to be able to serve load. Next slide. So SPP and MISO, a few years ago, we went forward on trying to develop a new type of study. We called it our Joint Targeted Interconnection Queue Study. SPP and MISO, you can see our footprints there in the picture. It's a pretty wide seam across our footprints. And this is some of the richest wind areas in the entire United States. And so throughout our normal queues, a lot of the individual projects that were siting along that seam ended up dropping out because upgrade costs were too cost prohibitive. So John Barrett, MISO CEO, and Brenda Suggs, CEO of SPP, asked Casey's team and my team to get together and find out a better way to look at how you can integrate new resources across that seam. And so we came up with a study, and we said, hey, we're already doing long-term planning and looking at what our future resources are going to be 5, 10, 20 years in the future. Let's use those resources, put them into a generator connection study, and see what kind of constraints would show up along this seam, and what would be the best lines to build to mitigate that congestion. If we can come up with better projects that are bigger, taking into consideration more generation interconnection than what you would normally see in an individual queue cycle, we could probably come up with better upgrades that would be cheaper in the long run, and you could spread those costs across multiple generation cycles. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see what the result of that study was. The project was originally 7 projects. 2 of them end up being built as part of MISO's tranche 1 of our long vision plan. But these remaining 5 projects continue to be built. These lines are mainly to enable generation interconnection within this area. So the actual benefits to load themselves are actually kind of low, just at 16% or 0.16 BC for the load. But a lot of the benefit is really to the future generation that will site in and around these lines, the ability to gain interconnection service for a cheaper costs. So that's the big task in front of us now, is trying to develop what the cost allocation mechanism should be in order to get this portfolio of projects paid for. We see these as being generation interconnection projects, and so we're looking to allocate the cost of these projects in the same manner as we allocate generation interconnection projects now that are 345 kV and above, which is 90% to generators and 10% to load. So we hope to have that the tariff changes necessary to implement this done within the next few months and filed to FERC by the end of the summer. Next slide. So a lot of the last few slides are talking about the queue reforms that we're looking to do, or the queue enhancements that we're doing to get generation online. We're also concerned about generation that's retiring. There's been a lot of regulations that have happened recently that are causing generation to retire maybe a little earlier than planned. We don't want to step in the way of that, but we do want to ensure that those changes to generation asset, the generation fleet now, are done in a reliable manner. And one of the things that we're seeing is that the loss of a lot of spinning reserves on the system is causing the need to have more stability studies performed as we are studying the loss of this generation. So in order to be able to run the stability studies that are necessary and then to look for alternatives for any reliability issues that may come up, we've extended the time necessary to study a retirement request from 26 weeks to 1 year. Of course, in the state of Missouri, there was a recent coal plant that was set to retire, Rush Island. We studied it for reliability issues. We found stability issues associated with retirement of that resource. So we have kept it online as a system support resource. We've identified network upgrades that need to be put in place to allow that plant to retire. And so now we're working with the local utility to get those built to allow that resource to retire. One of the things that we're also noticing is that the amount of load that we would allow to be shed in order to allow a resource to come offline is a significant amount of load. So we're looking at making some changes there so that we can continue to maintain reliability as this energy evolution continues to occur. Next slide. Some other recent reforms that we're looking to make or have made recently. One is our resource adequacy construct. So we just kicked off our 23-24 yearly capacity auction last Friday. And this will be our first auction that is 4 seasons instead of a 1-year auction. It's going to be 4 individual seasons. And we're also looking to say, what's the next big improvement for that resource adequacy construct, and should we continue to define some type of reliability-based demand curve in order to price that generation so that when we're close, when we have enough reserves, but we're barely have enough reserves, are we pricing that appropriately? So we're continuing to look at improvements we can make to the pricing, as well as how much accreditation should each resource get, whether that be load modifying resources or renewable resources. We heard about demand response earlier today. That's a load modifying resource. So how do we take into consideration the advancement of those on the distribution level in order to procure that and utilize those resources to serve load? So a lot of continued reforms that we're moving forward. The next slide is looking at some of the challenges that we faced recently. We've seen 4 major storms over the last 5 years, from the polar vortex of 18 and 19. There wasn't a major storm in 20, but then you had Uri, and then just recently last year in 21 and 22, or 22 was Winter Storm Elliott. So this chart here is looking at the wind drop that we've had across the system during Uri for a multi-day period. And so we're trying to consider, how do we take that into consideration, both in our planning perspectives but also our real-time perspectives, from a resource adequacy perspective. How are we ensuring that generation is available when we need it? So what needs to be done to reduce the amount of outages that we see during cold weather and extreme weather? How do we procure enough capacity for times of wind drought or solar drought? How do we take advantages of energy transfer from parts of the system that do have that availability to where we don't? And finally, one of the next big changes that MISO is trying to better understand is attributes. So if you go to the last slide, we want to go away from talking about thermal resources and non-thermal resources and really talk about the attributes that any generation asset could provide, whether they be weather dependent assets like solar and wind, to carbon-based resources like gas and coal. What are the actual attributes that those resources provide? And let's start looking at how do we procure those attributes versus just looking at generation from a thermal or non-thermal perspective. And so we have identified these 6 attributes initially. We want to better understand, better determine how much of each attribute is needed on the system. And so then we can better understand how we might be able to procure that asset, whether that be fuel assurance or long duration, high output, the ability to ramp up quickly to combat the duck curve that you've heard a lot about coming out of California ISO. The idea that when people are going home in the evenings, the load increases, but also at the same time that the sun is going down, and so you're losing a lot of solar capacity. So how do you procure enough ramp up and quick start capacity in order to combat that duck curve? And so that is where MISO is looking to go in the future with system attributes. So I'll hand it over to Casey now, and he's going to give a similar overview of SPP, and hopefully we'll be able to take some Q&A at the end.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon. So yeah, very timely and pertinent topics this whole conference, really. Thanks, Andy. So I will be providing more of an SPP take, and we did coordinate a little bit, so there's a little bit new information, except for the very first couple of slides. So this is a regional map of SPP. In the red is SPP's primary business functions. We go all the way up. We actually have a tie and a new joint project with Saskatchewan Power, which will allow for another 650 megawatt transfer to Canada. So that's kind of interesting. Everyone in the world, I think you all realize this, we're all facing this same issue. EPRI is working on internationally and trying to determine what resource adequacy metrics are necessary. And we're looking at different countries, but Saskatchewan is in the same boat. They've got coal and they've got gas, and they're trying to convert to wind and solar. And so they're kind of seen as an option to purchase upwards of 650 megawatts of firm from SPP's market. Off to the west is our expansion efforts. We currently have a variety of efforts at SPP, mostly competing with California ISO. We are providing reliability coordination services as well as a Western Energy Imbalance service, but something that's kind of novel and somewhat recent is we are the program operator working with Western Power Pool, which used to be the Northwest Power Pool. We are helping them stand up a Western Resource Adequacy Program, which is really a combination. I need to work with communications on this. It's a combination of the peach and the blue. So it's a pretty massive area where we're trying to, I say novel because most of the RA construct is within a particular tariff for ISO, and this is a standalone tariff for resource adequacy purposes. So it's kind of interesting, and we're learning things there and kind of sharing best practices across both footprints. as Andy mentioned, I guess MISO's queue is more than double the peak. We're about in the same boat. So we peak, we're a lot less load in our footprint than MISO. Our territory is 18 million customers. We peak at just shy of 54 gigawatts. But this is fairly recent. I think it's about a week old, so it's probably already out of date. We have 500, just shy of 600 projects. Something that Arjun reviewed 841. I geek out on this, but can you guess how many megawatts we actually had in the queue when FERC Order 841 dropped? It's 841 megawatts. It's so I thought that was interesting. It's kind of silly. But as you can see, that was in what, 2018, you said? So time changed, and now we're at 22 gigawatts. So we're no longer just shy of 1 gigawatt. We actually have a lot of battery storage in our queue. We only have 3 batteries in our footprint, so we're certainly in our infancy and operating a lot of batteries. Same thing with solar. We have a lot of solar that's signed, ready to go. We also have, for the first time this last year, solar exceeds wind in our queue. So we actually have a massive amount of solar in our queue as well. So those are kind of the observations. Wind is still a big deal, though, and so it's still growing. So projection of retirements, this is kind of hot off the press based on our annual integrated transmission plan, similar to MISO's LRTP. And really trying to forecast our overall retirements and projections. This is the first year that we've actually started using IRPs versus, and traditionally members kind of push back on using IRPs. They really wanted to go age-based and kind of cherry pick which ones actually get retired in the transmission plan. We're leveraging people's IRPs this time in our transmission planning process. So this kind of gives you an illustration of we do multiple futures, kind of bookends, to try to predict where things are going based on a business case and trying to design the overall futures and transmission plans. But it just at a high level, you can kind of see the wind growing, solar starting to ramp up, and then obviously that's offsetting coal and gas. But future 2 is a little bit more aggressive in terms of the amount of solar and wind that gets built. And what we'll do is we'll build a transmission portfolio for both futures and then kind of blend them together and then build a risk portfolio based on BC ratios and so forth. And really come up with a financial assessment of risk. You do some gas price sensitivities and so forth to just come up with a solid portfolio, because it takes a long time to build transmission. And so we're looking 2, 5, and 10 years out every year on a rolling basis and just trying to make sure we're getting ahead of really what's happening. Similar to what Andy reviewed from the JTIQ perspective, we do a very similar process regionally as well. This gives you an idea of the wind. What's kind of interesting is just a back of the envelope calculation. We've built roughly every year for the last 9 years, 2,800 megawatts of wind every single year. And so if you just do the quick math, that's like standing up a two to three turbines every single day for 9 straight years. That's getting energized. So it's a lot of wind. Very quickly. I remember when I joined SPP almost 18 years ago, we only had like 500 megawatts of wind, and the RCs were they just thought it was an annoyance. It was like a nuisance. It didn't really matter that we had a screen up. Well, now it's an asset. It's funny how times have changed. So we actually rely on a large part of the wind. But this kind of shows the green and the blue is historical. So that's what's been installed. And then those are our different futures. And as you can see, each year we kind of learn more and more, and we try to update our projections of actually what's going to get built out of the queue. And I think our members have also changed their tune in terms of what their appetite for taking on some of this non-firm wind, because they're seeing the benefit. Maybe they have loads that want to connect. They're seeing, and they're changing their IRPs. So there's a lot more of an appetite to basically say, yeah, this wind is actually coming. So we need to project it and build some economic planning projects out of it. So that's where the purple ends up jumping to the gold. So we had the purple last year, and that was scoped for this year's planning cycle, and then it bumped up to the gold. And this is member vetted numbers. So it's not just what SPP thinks; it's what our members agree to, so that we can actually build transmission out of. Okay, so resource adequacy, I'll try not to repeat a lot of what Andy said. At the end of the day, RA is kind of a risk assessment. You can't build capacity overnight either. So you have to make sure that you have enough bench strength. And traditionally, it was fairly straightforward. The city of Omaha or the city of Kansas would grow at a certain percentage of load, and then you would kind of run the numbers and build a peaker plant. Well, now everything's changed. You have seasonal changes. You have maintenance windows that are shortening. We actually have a phenomenon at SPP that's quite interesting because during shoulder periods, we have wind ramps. We have really high, good wind, but then we lose 10 gigs of wind in 5 hours. We have to be able to bounce that back. We don't have any solar to bounce against it. We don't have any storage yet, and that might be a very useful tool eventually. But right now, what we use is gas. Well, what happens during shoulder months? Maintenance. So we're having this really weird situation. This is just recent in the last couple of years. So instead of just traditional planned maintenance and planned maintenance outages during the shoulder periods, we're actually having to deny planned outages simply because of the rampable capacity need. Normally, you would deny a planned outage because of transmission, right? You'd have too much transmission going out and you need to keep a resource on and you're trying to stagger. Now we've introduced another layer of complexity because we have to hold back certain conventional resources from taking their outages so that we can stagger that just because the amount of wind potential that we actually have. So it's a very interesting problem, very challenging. But at the end of the day, right now we have kind of an axe, and it's the planning reserve margin. So we've just recently raised our planning reserve margin from 12 to 15%, which is a significant bump. But that's not really an elegant solution to what we're actually facing. So a number of the challenges that and recommended changes that Andy reviewed, that's what SPP is doing as well. We're not technically, right now, we're not going to a 4-season. We're introducing a winter PRM, but we're also introducing something called expected unserved energy. So we're trying to measure the amount of load that's at risk, not just the 1 day in 10 event calculation, but when it actually does occur. What we've seen with renewables is high injection of renewables and a fleet of renewables. When an event occurs, you can actually lose more load. And so what we're trying to do is balance that. So we're sending a signal to the market to kind of complement the fuel mix. And it really comes down to, I believe the fellow from Evergy kind of made note of some of those different looks of what types of mix they're moving toward in Evergy. Well, we really need to send that signal regionally. And, we're fuel type agnostic. We don't run a capacity market, but the states manage the resource adequacy. But as a regional operator, we have to make sure that we're sending that proper signal. So it's not just system inertia or primary frequency response. It's also rampable capacity and flexible resources. So instead of just having the PRM go to 300%, and having to just overbuild wind, maybe we can complement that with some rampable resources. So that's something that we're looking into. This is kind of another illustration of what we're seeing. I mean, when you actually run the planning processes, it's system intact. You're running different scenario based, but what we've seen in operations is the reality is the capacity that's actually available is not necessarily aligned with what we're actually planning for. So we have to kind of hedge that as well. One last topic I wanted to note that I think might be interesting, especially for Missouri, is that we had a significant weather event in Winter Storm Elliott. This is this blue. I'll give you a second to kind of get your eyes adjusted to the Missouri area. But this is mostly a voltage problem. Now, we don't plan for N-6. It's almost a gold plate in the system at that point. You just can't plan for all of the various deep matrices of conditions. We plan N-1. However, what we've uncovered are very common frames of common mode outages. And we recently built a transmission facility, actually a couple of transmission facilities up in North Dakota for a very similar type of situation. Every winter they have high load. They have a couple of wind farms that don't operate because it's winter. And then one gas turbine trips off and one transmission feeder in the Basin Bakken area trips, then it causes voltage collapse. And so the entire region, and this is kind of impressive, the entire region, and they all help pay for this transmission, even down in New Mexico, they all rallied behind the North Dakota members and said, yes, we need to build that transmission facility. Well, similar to what happened in Joplin, the city of Utilities Springfield, they're kind of doing the same thing. They're saying, look, we don't want to build for Elliott. That's kind of a no-brainer. You don't want to build for a very specific, because when it happens again, it's going to be shifted. It's going to be shifted just like the polar vortex and Winter Storm Uri. It's going to happen again, but it's going to happen a little bit different. But what we did do is we scoped out a framework to basically build in a resilience model to where we're looking at a regional resilience model and we're looking at common mode failures. So we're still looking at economic transmission planning processes, but we're also trying to couple that with, if there are some on the cusp regional reliability problems and you introduce a resilience type of study, then that would kind of check the box and say, look, this is a good transmission plan. So it's trying to optimize economics, reliability, and resilience all at the same time. So we're going to do that in our next 2024 study. The last thing I want to mention is we did one, I guess it's unfortunate, we actually have some notice to construct transmission builds. These were already planned and done, so it's out of SPP's hands, but they weren't energized yet for Elliott. And we did some post-analysis to say what was already in our plan, would that have helped? And it would have. In fact, I want to say it was around 230 voltage violations, and it wouldn't have solved everything, but it would have dropped it down to about 20. So it significantly reduced the overall risk. So we wanted to go ahead and go eyes wide open to say, look, we are building transmission in the area, but it just takes a lot of time. But again, we're going to stress the system even further to build from that. So with that, that's all I have. I guess we have some time for questions or for Andy as well.
Thank you, Casey, so much. Yes, we've got a question in the back. I apologize. Arjun, if you want to ask, we can just repeat it. I'll get the microphone up.
Thanks for this information. Really interesting. I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about resources.
Yep.
To what extent are regions considering? And I sort of heard about it recently, just kind of Texas, like Bitcoin. Thank you. Like Bitcoin, farms have this ability to instantaneously just open up, 250 megawatts in a load constrained area or a transmission constrained area. So where does that sort of fit into the future of system planning from your perspectives?
So from an SPP perspective, we have a demand response policy team that kind of reports to the supply adequacy working group that establishes the resource adequacy criteria, and they're working on that. I can say that every time we talk to certain customers that want to have interruptible load, and even the ones that we actually have, when you interrupt them, they basically say, well, when are you going to put me back? So I'm just, in most of my career, like Andy is, from operations point of view. So we currently have 800 megawatts of demand response accredited. We're doing some analysis and prediction and working with members on that, but I'm personally a little bit skeptical on how much do we leverage that, because it doesn't seem like they really want to to truly reduce when we need them to. So
Andy, there's a question online of the JTIQ report, if that is available online.
Yep, and I provided the answer in the chat, so you should be able to just flip over to the answered tab and you can get a link to the report.
Fantastic, thank you.
Just had a question about how does the expected unserved energy concept differ from the traditional loss of load expectation? I mean, is it more conservative? Does it look at different variables?
Yeah, so what we're doing at SPP, and really internationally, we've kind of looked at this too. It's called, some other countries are looking at it and establishing what's called a normalized expected unserved energy. And so what we found globally is it's kind of a range of what they call parts per million. So it's 0.001% of your total load for an annual year. So if we have 270 terawatt hours, then it's 270 megawatts is your kind of threshold of expected unserved energy. How that complements the loss of load expectation is, the loss of load expectation is just a Monte Carlo simulation to shift load and shift generation to come up with and you try to remove generation to come up with an optimal framework of saying when you actually have a 1 day in 10 or 0.1 day a year in the model. And that's just an event calculation. So you're just calculating when it actually occurs. What EUE does is it says when it does occur, how much load was lost. And that's the piece that traditionally you didn't really use. The last 54 60 years, it's always worked with the 1 in 10, and that was enough. Well, now with a lot of wind and solar, there's a lot of variables. So what we're seeing is with a large injection of wind and solar, we may be meeting the 0.1 day a year, but then we're seeing the actual loss load at risk be triple what it normally was. And so what we're trying to do is establish that criterion. What's the appetite for risk? Working with the states and members really to make sure. I mean, if they're okay with the risk, that's one thing, but that just means that we need to establish what that point is. And then the next step is, okay, what do we do about it? Once we establish that threshold, then how can we fix it? And currently it's with gas, but it could be with storage or other newer technology.
So going back, kind of building off the question about study results for JTIQ, every state obviously has different priorities. Is there a way to see the JTIQ results, not just, Missouri specific context, but also sort of with the benefit and cost layers built in, so you can sort of build them up yourself depending on what particular interest you have?
Is that, Andy, did you get that?
Yeah, I mean, JTIQ isn't like LRTP, that multi-value projects that we've developed along with mission planning. The benefit to JTIQ is really to the generators that want to come online, that are looking to connect in that area. So a lot of the benefits that may be, say, policy driven from one state or another, the benefits to carbon or carbon reduction or losses and things like that, none of those benefits were calculated for JTIQ like they were for LRTP. So there's not a way to necessarily go in there and look at the different benefits to the system. We just did a BC for the generation, or for the load in MISO and the load in SPP, to get a common benefit to cost ratio utilizing adjusted production costs. And then we looked at the amount of generation that was enabled because of this portfolio. And so those are the real two benefits that we look at in the report. And that kind of justifies the cost allocation that we're trying to put in place for JTIQ, which would be 90% of the costs borne by the generators that will connect in the area and be able to connect at a cheaper rate because of these lines, and then 10% spread across SPP and MISO load. That's roughly commensurate with the amount of benefits they get based on adjusted production costs.
Yeah, Andy, correct me. The anchor amount of gigawatts we calculated for this to be successful was super low, right? It was 26 gigawatts or something. Do you recall? I want to say it was about less than 10% of what was in our queue. So in terms of just who was bringing it, the concern was, well, if you build it, they will come. Well, it doesn't really require that much to be built for it to be justified.
Yeah, that's right. We calculated 28 gigawatts of enablement across the MISO and SPP footprint because of JTIQ.
Yep.
Thank you. That does help my thought process a little bit. I guess the sort of natural follow-up question, and I think I know the answer, is do you have a sense where the generation would be enabled, or is it a little more system-wide?
No, it's the generation that would be enabled is within that close proximity to the MISO and SPP border. Our proposal actually is to use a LODF calculation or a DFAX calculation and say generation that's within 5% of the MISO SPP border, meaning that 5% of the generation from that new request is going to flow across the MISO and SPP border. Those are the generators that would benefit from this portfolio. And so those are the new requests that we would get, that we would charge that 90% of the total $1 billion portfolio to those future resources. So it's a pretty large footprint. It's most of SPP, and it's pretty much all the MISO West region, spreading across almost 8 states.
Great. Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Casey. Thank you, Andy. Everybody, please join me in thanking both. All right. That will actually conclude our conference. Again, I can't do this without folks like Rachel and Matt. Definitely not without sponsors like Evergy and Ameren, the Nature Conservancy, Spire, Polsinelli, our partners at RTO Insider Energy Bar Association, the Energy News Network, and the Missourians for Balanced Energy Future. And as a reminder, we are having our conference in Columbia, August 29th, on energy efficiency. And the day before, we'll be doing one on property assessed clean energy. It will focus 100% on the commercial side. It has nothing to do with residential. And our economic development conference will be in December, very similar to infrastructure. It's very broad. So put those on your calendar. If you have ideas, some topics you want us to discuss or consider, don't hesitate to contact us and give us those suggestions. We will be sending out a survey for today. If you fill out the survey, you'll get the PowerPoints right away. And if you don't, you wait a while. It's our incentive for you to tell us how we're doing. Any input is good input. So appreciate that. For those of you who are here, you can, if you haven't already, you can get your parking tag voucher at the desk as you go towards the elevator. And there was going to be something else to say. Thank you very much for coming. And I hope you all learned something, made some contacts, spurred some type of conversation. We will be sending out the paper that was done by MEI along with our thank you and survey here in the next day or so. So again, thank you for participating. It's good to have started to do more things in person. I look forward to seeing you all in August and December. Thank you all.